We are recording. Here we go in 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Boilers Extra. I'm Nathan Baird from the Indianapolis Star.
Sam King from the Journal and Courier.
Thanks to welcome to those of you who maybe are catching up. We've been doing this for a few weeks, but this is going to be our routine through the season. You're going to get, at least through football season, you're going to get a midweek hit from us on previewing the football game and then talking some basketball like we're going to do today. There is some basketball news this week that we're going to get into at the end of this preview pod, but mostly we're going to be previewing the football game that's coming up each week, and this happens to be the season opener this week against the Fighting Sam Kings of Indiana State, my co-host's alma mater. And before we kind of delve into the Purdue side of things, let's briefly give people an overview of Indiana State. It was 56-0 the last time these two teams played a couple of years ago. This gap should not have shrunk much since then, but Sam, tell our listeners a little bit about the Sycamores.
Yeah, so Indiana State is, it's a program that's struggled. It's a tough place to win, and it has even back when I was in school, and the team was going through 1 win and 0-win seasons. Off a winner.
Did you consider walking on? Did you consider becoming the Rudy of Indiana State football?
So this is very strange. I played high school football, never ran track or cross country or anything, but when I went there, I realized kind of what my athletic abilities were. And I had mentioned something to the track team of like, hey, when I was in high school, they said I would have made a really good 400, 800 runner. And then the coach is like, well, you need to be doing these workouts. And, at the time that didn't appeal to me, being 18 and away from home and the joys of college. I didn't follow through on all of that, but probably for better anyway. But no, there were some good players on those teams. I actually lived in a dorm with the football team on a floor. So I did know some of those guys, but it was a struggle to win, and continues to be a struggle to win. 13.5 points a game last year for the offense. Best returning player on that offense is probably Plez Lawrence, who was a standout running back at Kokomo High School, kind of close to Lafayette, was on the Missouri Valley all-newcomer team last year. It looked like the returning stars, if you will, for Indiana State were on the defensive side. A couple of guys who were second-team all-conference, one of them being a defensive back, which, strangely enough, both of these teams' leading tacklers last year were out of the secondary. But there's a player named Maddox Blackwell who had 107 tackles for Indiana State last year, 2 interceptions, I think 3 or 4 forced fumbles. One of them was a 75-yard touchdown return against Indiana. So clearly, probably a capable player who's going to be tested by Purdue's receiving core. And then linebacker Garrett, I think it's Olendike, but he also had quite a bit of tackles and was the team's leader in sacks, leader in tackles for loss. So it looks like maybe the strength of this Indiana State team is probably, some of the guys on the defensive side of the ball.
That's, I think, plenty of Indiana State talk for 1 week or 1 year, as it is. Each week we're going to get into, we'll have a lot more to say about Notre Dame in a couple of weeks and where the specific important matchups are in that game. That doesn't really so much apply to this one. I do think, though, it's interesting that teams that struggle defensively tend to have safeties who lead them in tackles. It was true last year of Purdue. It's not a knock against Dylan Thieneman at all, because obviously he's very talented. But as we've said before, Purdue is better off this year if Dylan Thieneman is not leading this team in tackles. So let's take the focus back to Purdue. Let's catch people up on who's actually going to be able to play on Saturday. And I think there's a big distinction at this point of the season, and for a game like this, between who is going to play and who can play and who should play. How about we say it like that? Ryan Walters brought this up a few weeks ago, like in the middle of preseason camp, when we were asking about guys who we weren't seeing or guys who were limited. And he said, well, if we had to play a game today, some of those guys would be out here. They were taking things very cautious. And because of the way this schedule plays out, they get to do that up into the season.
Right.
But we know that CJ Smith and Nyland Green have both pretty much been ruled out for this game for a while, hoping to have those guys back for Notre Dame. Corey Stewart was listed on the depth chart this week where those other 2 guys weren't. But when I asked Ryan Walters about him, he said, it's possible. And I definitely took it as, and we know Corey Stewart was back at practice this week.
Right.
But we it sounded very dubious as to whether he would play this week because, again, why push it when you've got a game that's a very winnable game to start with, and then you get a week off, you get to come at maximum strength for Notre Dame, which leads us to the next thing I was going to bring up, which was we don't talk to coaches on the record midweek, the way that they've structured it this year. We don't get to watch practice, but sometimes we get in to see the end of practice. And we noticed on Wednesday that both Will Helt and DeMarge Lewis, who are two guys who are either, obviously Will Helt's going to be starting at rush end. Lewis will be in that defensive tackle mix at the very least. Didn't look like they were in pads, at least for the end of practice. And I don't know what that means. It's just something we'll be monitoring for Saturday morning. But it's also something that even if it were a thing where those guys were going to have to miss a game, it's nothing that you overreact to, because I think Purdue is and should be making decisions about who plays in this game differently than they would make him about any other game on the schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. And, defensive tackle is a position I specifically asked about Monday's press conference because they had 5 starters listed for 3 positions. You do the math, all 5 of those guys are not going to be starting that game. And it seemed like, what defensive coordinator Kevin Kane said was, we're pretty deep. Rick Haley likes that room, likes what he's got. That, a telling sign if there's 5 capable starters and you can't distinguish which one is ahead of the other. And a lot of that probably depends on, formations and things of that sort. But because of the depth that Purdue has, a lot of this based on last year and going through a lot of injuries, especially on the offensive line, maybe is why you're a little hesitant about just saying Corey Stewart's going to play in this opening game. You're much better off if there's any question at all, or even if they're 100%, but, missed some practice time or whatever, to let them just sit this one out, come back, practice the next week in a bye week where you're probably not going full haul, and just kind of starting to implement some Notre Dame stuff. And then the next week you come out and you're, hopefully at full strength when you play a major game on national TV, that's going to have far more viewers and far more, reason to win, I guess. Not that there's not a reason to beat Indiana State, but if you knock off Notre Dame, you kind of get yourself on a national scale. You're going to be on every sports talk show and things of that sort for the next week.
Yeah, that game just really looms huge early in the season as a potential measuring stick. And it either will be or it won't be. What a take. It either will be or it won't be. If we turn out Notre Dame is just that much better right now than a lot of other teams, including Purdue, and they've put themselves in that small category, then so be it. And maybe this game doesn't tell us a lot about Purdue because there is that big of a difference. But if Purdue has closed that gap and can be competitive in that game, I think it tells us where this season could go for Purdue, even though there are big tests like that throughout the season. Let's talk about who will play and who we're eager to see play. So we thought we'd each go through 3 players we're eager to see on Saturday, because there is so much new around this team, between the transfer portal, between some true freshmen who are showing out in preseason camp. So who would be first on your list? Who is maybe the player in this game that you're most eager to see?
It's a toss-up, but I'm going to go with Teron Grant, because this is a guy who, technically was supposed to be in the 2025 class, reclassified back to what his original classification was, which is 2024, comes to Purdue early, and now he's going to be starting, in one of those corner spots. And part of that is because, one of the starting corners has not been at practice in recent weeks, but also, coaches like him. He's elevated himself up the depth chart. He's 6'3", 200 pounds, even as a guy who would be a senior in high school right now. He's pretty big, and I think that when you factor in, we talked about Dylan Thieneman and all the tackles he made last year, having Dylan Thieneman in the back, and then you've upgraded with Kendrick Breedlove, and then with Teron Grant coming in, and eventually Green, and so forth and so on. I think that it's great if you're a true freshman, you can come in, start that first game, especially against an opponent like Indiana State, and kind of just get thrown into the fire and see, okay, are they ready for what's about to come here, where presumably for the first time you're playing in front of 60,000 people. And, you're seeing as a guy who would be a high school senior right now, you're seeing 22, 23 in college anymore, 25, 26-year-olds that you have to go against.
Yeah, Taron Grant obviously on my list too. I don't know that he would be starting if Nyman Green were healthy this week,
Right.
but I don't know that that really matters because it still means that as a true freshman, you came in and put yourself in position to be on the two deep of a secondary that clearly upgraded its talent from last year. And there's still guys on that side of the ball who started last year who aren't going to be starters anymore. And that's when you start talking about how you know you've improved your defense. And it's not really a knock against those guys, but when you've brought in guys who can beat them out and make your starters your backups, you've clearly improved your depth. And Taron Grant, I tweeted something this week about how maybe it's just something from the press conference on Monday, and all these people from down where he's from started like retweeting that and passing it around, and you can tell it's like a big exciting moment for his fan base, his high school fan base, and I'm really eager to see this too. Again, I think Purdue is in a really unique position with these true freshmen, and we're going to transition this into talking about Shamar Rigby. But when you've got a true freshman who comes in and shows you anything in this day and age, I kind of think you really need to get him on the field as fast as possible, not push somebody to something they're not ready for. But I almost wonder if you have to be thinking, if you're Purdue, are you thinking we maybe need to let this guy figure it out on the field, deal with some of the growing pains and mistakes if they come, because you can't really wait around anymore in the transfer portal for a guy to be fully developed. That's not me saying that Purdue definitely can't hold on to its best players. I'm not saying that at all. And that's clearly what they're trying to do behind the scenes, and every team is with NIL and everything. But I do think that if you wait around and don't give him that opportunity quickly, it doesn't send a great message to the other guys that you're trying to recruit at that level. And you're also potentially opening yourself up to somebody being able to come in and more easily swipe him because they can plausibly argue that you weren't getting the opportunity there. So I don't know if that's in the mindset of any of the coaches right now. That isn't something a subject I've broached with them yet, but I do wonder if this is if we're going to start seeing, number one, Purdue has to get players like this, which it does infrequently. If it can start to increase the frequency, then it'll be a better gauge of whether what I'm talking about is true. But when it does get guys like Taron Grant and they come in and they look ready as a freshman, I think they've got to get on the field in an accelerated way, have a big role, not only because of what I was just talking about, but also because I think the ceiling is higher on that talent. And sometimes the best way to get that help them reach that ceiling is to let them figure it out on the field.
Yeah, last year, people may not remember this, but there were players who ended up starting for the first time against Ohio State and against Michigan. And that is not the introduction you want them to have, because, especially, the talent levels of those two teams last year. If you go out and get burned as a defensive back, in your first, quarter of playing college football, your confidence maybe gets shot a little bit, especially if you're talented enough to where, you're not used to that. A lot of these guys probably aren't at JUCO or at the high school level. And then you come in and you're facing a guy who's going to be playing in the NFL, the next season. You don't want that to be the first opportunity that you get. I think this is a great move. Even if Taron Grant didn't elevate himself in starter based off of performance, which it sounds like he did, I think it's a great move just to say, like, hey, great job. You came in here, you proved that you can hang, and we're going to give you a chance here.
That was Siegel High School in Tennessee, by the way, the Taron Grant's fan base that was going crazy.
A lot of retweeters over there.
Yeah, but we love it, and they're excited to see him, and especially because they know he reclassified. He's only been on campus a few months, and whatever the circumstances, he's out there on day one. And I think if Nyman Green were healthy and starting on Saturday, he would have made my list, and I am very eager to see what he looks like and how his presence, from what I saw in camp, I just feel like his presence can be a little sort of transformative for this secondary and can have ripple effects through the defense. So he would have made my list if he were healthy and playing on opening day. Let's talk about Shamar Rigby, who was on my list and I assume is also on your list. And his story is even more impressive to me because, yes, there have been some guys banged up at the receiver core throughout the course of camp also. But Shamar Rigby shows up in the summer and is starting on opening day. And it's one thing if you're a true freshman and you start on opening day. And Sam, I know you wrote earlier this week about how unique that is, and you can get into that in a second, just in recent Purdue history. But you show up in July and you're starting on August 31st. That is a jump. And it isn't necessarily because there's someone in front of him, obviously, because I think CJ Smith would be starting, but not outside. He'd probably be starting in the slot the way things that we were seeing early in camp, right? So I think this is just Shamar Rigby showed up and said, I'm your starter. I'm a starting receiver on this team. And he went out and won it. And that should really excite Purdue fans that you have players. And this is not Taron Grant, who was a really kind of highly rated prospect. This is someone who was a little bit under the radar, played in what I understand was maybe more of a like run heavy offense down in Florida and didn't get showcased as much. And this didn't have the same hype around him coming in. And he kind of created his own hype and showed up and beyond the plays he was making on the field. And we saw some of those in our windows of preseason camp, but it was also the way he's carried himself around the team, the way he some guys just have the vibe and they show up and they act like they belong there, whether or not anybody else thinks they belong there yet or not. And it sounds like that's what happened here. So I don't know if he stays in the starting lineup, but it tells you something that they're listing him as a starter. Taron Grant's been here for a few months, several months now at this point. You could barely say that Shamar Rigby's been here for several weeks.
Yeah. And I know you were off to the side yesterday, but there was a little media scrum that talked to Jamal Edrin. And one of the questions he was asked was, what do you think of Shamar Rigby coming in here and being a starter and, only been here, like you said, a little more than a month, I guess. And he said he earned it. It's not like this guy was just given a gift and said, hey, we're going to give you a chance here. We've heard all through camp, coaches, teammates talking about, this guy came here and he's different. And
from day one, basically.
Like the way he goes about his work, he keeps his head down. He's, not a showboat or a flamboyant guy. He just, goes out there, makes a play, hands the ball back to the official or the coach in this case, whoever it might be, and goes back and does it again. So definitely a guy that you're right, was on my list, somebody that I really want to see, because what we've seen so far is these guys playing against their own teammates, and it can get stale. You're going against the same guys every single day for weeks on end, and now you finally get a chance to go out and play against somebody else and showcase, what you've been doing in camp that has elevated you to a starting role. And there's a reason he's in the starting lineup, and it's clearly because of what he's done the past 3 weeks.
What again was that history on how many?
So
especially two freshmen starting on opening day.
Yeah. So obviously Purdue has started multiple true freshmen in games over the past 5 years. That happened late last season, for instance. But on opening day, which is rare. I mean, if you we're talking about Shamar Rigby, if you can be here either in the spring before the season or even come in the summer or at the beginning of the fall and be a starter, basically a month later, you're really, probably pretty talented. And I was thinking, went back to every starting lineup as far back until I found the last time 2 players had started as true freshmen on the opening day. We're not talking about red shirts or guys who were in the transfer portal and came here and are playing their first college game, just true freshmen right out of high school. And I thought, as I got back to 2020 and it hadn't happened, I was like, well, surely in 2019, David Bell and George Karlaftis both started. Well, David Bell didn't start. So that might tell you, he's clearly in Cleveland now playing for the Browns, and had a tremendous career at Purdue. And, half of his career stats probably came against Iowa, but that's neither here nor there. He was a really good player, and he wasn't good enough to start, or if he was good enough to start, he still didn't earn a starting spot in his first game. But it was 2019, and it was Jalen Graham, who now plays for the 49ers, and George Karlaftis, who's clearly done quite well for himself too. Both of those guys have been in a Super Bowl. One of them's won 2 of them in his first 2 years in the NFL. So it's not easy. You have to be a special talent probably at any Power 4 program to be in the starting lineup as a true freshman on the first game.
That's actually a good perspective, that it's 2 guys who are now in the NFL, who quickly got to the NFL and have made a role for themselves. In the case of Karlaftis, obviously even much more than a role. Like that's a good, again, you don't want to put predictions on guys like that necessarily. I'm not saying that either one of these guys is going to have the George Karlaftis career of their position, because he was a pretty great player. But it tells you something about what it takes. And again, I don't know if you probably don't remember whether either of those guys didn't show up until the summer. Like, I assume both of those guys were probably spring enrollees. I don't remember about Graham.
I wasn't I was a secondary reporter of the team at that time. Obviously, I watched George throughout high school, and he graduated mid-year and enrolled at Purdue early and was there that spring. But, obviously he was the National High School Defensive Player of the Year, was a 2-time state champion in shot put, was a basketball player, just a freak elite athlete that, came from Greece, where he was a, standout water polo player of all things. So,
yeah. That's the thing that still just fascinates me right now. Like, if Shamar Rigby steps in from day one and stays in this starting lineup, having not gotten here until July, it's uncommon. Like, again, I'm not going to bring this up every week. I just came from covering a program that gets 5-star freshmen all the time. JT Tuimoloau is a name that people might know. He's one of the better defensive ends in the Big Ten right now. Was a great athlete for Ohio, that came into Ohio State. He didn't even commit until July. He had this really weird protracted recruitment. Anyway, he didn't even start on opening day. Now, he started before the end of his freshman year, and people thought that was amazing, that a guy with his athletic profile, like one of the top 5 prospects in the nation, was starting by the end of his freshman year. And they're like, can you believe that? He didn't get here until July, and now he's starting. And now Shamar Rigby's going to start on opening day for a Big Ten team. And I just think that you're probably going to find out as we listen to Boilers Extra, all of you out there. I tend to be someone who tempers expectations a little bit. Like, hey, okay, this looks good, but let's remember this perspective. I'm probably going to be a Debbie Downer sometimes, a wet blanket, whatever you want to use, because I like to I can't help but look at it through the, that kind of scrutiny, that skeptic's perspective sometimes. I think you're allowed to get excited about this. You've got two true freshmen starting on opening day. One of them didn't get here until July, and impressed. And this should have been hard. It was definitely harder this year for someone to come in and start either in the receiving core or the secondary than it was a year ago, right? At cornerback, especially. I mean, they elevated the talent level there. And even if it's partially because of injury in the case of Taron Grant, for Shamar Rigby they bring in more receiving talent. They make it harder every day in practice because you're going up against better defensive backs, and he still showed them enough to start on opening day. I think you're well within your means to get excited about that and start thinking big.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if he goes out and doesn't catch a ball, or he has one catch for 16 yards, it's still impressive. And,
it's the foundation. You're laying a foundation right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Who did you choose as maybe not your number 2 overall pick or whatever, but among your list of players you're eager to go out and see?
So I only put down 3 names, and we've already done 2 of them. I was like torn between who I put as my third one, and you could go any number of directions here. I went CJ Madden, and it's because early in camp, it looked like he was really running away almost with being the obvious guy to line up opposite Will Helt and be the other rush end, like the starting rush end. And then there would be sort of maybe a committee behind him. But maybe he was standing up and saying, like, no, like, we've got 2 guys, and then Sheeta Silla and everybody else would like spell them, rotate in, whatever. And then Sheeta Silla had the camp that he had and really pulled up, and now is listed as a starter for Saturday. So I still suspect that CJ Madden, what he is physically, what he has as a background at Georgia, what he had to go through in practice every day for the time he was there, just to it's harder to stand out in practice at Georgia than it is at Purdue. I don't think that's a ridiculous thing to say. So, like, the way he had to fight through that program for a couple of years, and now I just feel like we haven't seen probably the best of him yet. And I wonder if, like, a game scenario can start to maybe bring that out of him, and that we see if of the 2, I think Sheeta Silla is doing great things. I just wonder if the ceiling might be higher for CJ Madden, and if that starts to show up once the lights actually go on. Well, I guess they're playing at noon, but you know what I'm saying.
The funny thing about the 2 you just mentioned, Sheeta Silla and CJ Madden, is they're both listed as 6'4" and weight very similar, but they look completely different.
I do not agree.
I think I got an appreciation. We've talked to CJ Madden, and he's a big dude. But yesterday I was at a Purdue grad who does custom shoe designs, and he's doing a lot of the players who are going to be wearing, I guess they're all going to be wearing cleats, but he's doing cleats for a lot of the Purdue players that will be worn in Saturday's game. And I went there and I said, hey, just kind of show me who you're doing, like what you're doing. This guy's done shoes for several NFL players and things of that sort too, which was really interesting and intriguing. But my question was, like, what are these guys going to be wearing on Saturday, which is always a trending topic come game time. When these games are on TV and people see unique shoes, they go straight to the Google machine and, what is so-and-so wearing? I think you told me about seeing Marvin Harrison Jr. wear shoes at a game that became the biggest trending topic during a game last year.
Well, yeah, he was wearing some kind of, and I don't know shoes. I my shoe knowledge is, and I don't say this lightly, pathetic. Like, I just don't know about shoes or care about shoes very much at all. And so I can't tell. I think they were like maybe Louis Vuitton shoes or something like that. That's what got that notice, was that they were this, like, he was playing in like ultra designer shoes for some reason. And it only lasted a short amount of time. But yeah, anyway, how does that relate to CJ Madden?
I guess the story to relate it to CJ Madden was there's a table with all these shoes on there, and you see Ahmad Branch, Markevious Brown, several different players. And then I see these white and black Jordans. And I said, who's going to wear these? Because they're twice as big as any other shoe on the table. Oh, those are CJ Madden shoes. And I was like, okay. And I picked it up and I was like, you could probably pour a gallon of milk in these shoes and still have space in there. They're massive. So it just kind of gave me a new appreciation for this as a really massive guy. And then you see the way he can move. He's definitely an elite talent. I know he didn't get on the field much, if at all, at Georgia, but there was a reason he was a, highly sought after recruit that ended up at Georgia in the first place. And now he comes to Purdue and, obviously is going to get an opportunity to play, whether or not he's starting. He and Sheeta Silla are going to probably both play a lot of reps.
Yeah, I would definitely expect them both to play a lot on Saturday, regardless of the circumstances. And you could almost have said this as like a CJ Madden, Sheeta Silla is like one combination of guys that I didn't feel like that fit the spirit of what we were doing. So I picked one over the other. It just, those two guys, and I even asked Marcus Johnson about this, the O-line coach, a couple weeks ago, about the how tough that is for an offensive lineman if from snap to snap you're going against two guys who just profile so different athletically. And he admitted, like, yeah, that's not fun. That makes it tough. And I think Purdue is going to use that to its advantage over the course of this year. And you can even say the same thing. Will Helt is a little bit, he's longer than either of those two guys are. Like, he's a different athletic profile. The three of those guys, I had to do some bold predictions, and they were a little bit different than the ones I did on the pod last week, because I revised my thinking about some things. Also, I really screwed up my analysis of Wisconsin in a number of ways last week. So I didn't put that beating Wisconsin on the list. But one thing I did put on there was that Purdue leads the Big Ten in sacks this year. And now that's kind of outlandish because Abdul Carter, Penn State, they led last year, I think, and he's going to have a ton. And they had like 50-some sacks last year. They're going to have a lot of sacks. Iowa's always good defensively. But my premise was you've still got the same Ryan Walters attacking defense, and now you put a secondary where you've raised the talent level, makes quarterbacks hold the ball more, plus that attacking defense. I don't know that it necessarily matters whether Nick Scouton's up there or how often they're sending KJ Jenkins on blitzes. I think just this scheme, increasing the talent level in the secondary, can lead to more sacks. And I think he'll be involved in that. Madden will be involved in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the defensive line is more seasoned, and all those guys have played together now. And, I think where there were sacks to be had last year that weren't Jenkins or Scorton, it was on the defensive line breaking through. And, Mo Amanade had a few. I think Cole Brevard was able to wreak havoc just with his basically way to bulldoze and shove linemen into the backfield that led to a lot of sacks for other guys. So a lot of times it's, those guys who don't get the credit creating the havoc for the Russians to come in and, blast the guy trying to run away. But you're right. Last year you could escape that and throw it and, get a big chunk play out of it because you couldn't cover the receiver long enough to, make the payoff worth it. Instead, it turns into a big play because you've left a hole in the defense. But now I think you're right with the secondary that Purdue has. I think there's going to be less, chances taken, first of all, and then secondly, just those big plays. You're going to, hopefully have the receivers covered. And not turn what should be a loss or a play where the quarterback throws it out of bounds into 30 or 40 yards.
And sometimes D-line coaches are quick to point out, like, sacks aren't everything. And sometimes it's because they're trying to deflect why they're not getting enough sacks. But sometimes it's legitimate, because when you're creating pressure off the edge, you're doing one of two things. You're displacing the quarterback and making him have to do something like off platform. And this is true if the pressure's coming up the middle too. But also you're making them step up into the pocket. And again, that's going to be one of the things that this defense is really potentially poised to do very well. You're going to have 3 defensive tackles there, and you're going to have KJ Jenkins right behind him. And like that combination of guys that creates a hostile environment to step up into the pocket and try to do something. And again, if the coverage is tighter this year than it was last year, you hold it for just one more beat. Sometimes that beat is the only difference between whether you get a pass off and whether you're on the turf. Who else did you have on your list of guys that you want to see?
Well, this isn't a new guy, as the other ones we've mentioned are, to the Purdue roster, but Max Clare, the tight end, he was having, a tremendous freshman year last year, redshirt freshman year, I guess, early in the season through the first 3 or 4 games, and then he gets hurt. And I think part of the reason why Garrett Miller is now playing for Texas A&M was the elevation of Max Clare's game and just how reliable. I asked Hudson Card yesterday, you really developed a connection with Max Clare early last year. He was having several big games in a row. And he's like, yeah, he's a great tight end. He's kind of a great weapon to add to now what's a beefed up receiving core in terms of talent. So I really want to see, how does he, first of all, return from injury, but secondly, kind of build off of what got going the connection with Hudson Card early last season, because I think he's a guy who can do a lot of different things. And we haven't talked about this yet, but I'll be surprised if George Burren plays in this game, despite what Brian Bedford told me last Monday or the Monday before that, whenever I had asked, do you expect him to be ready? Because we haven't seen him out there. And again, there's no reason to try to half-injured guy out against Indiana State. So I think it's going to be Max Clare. I think it's going to be Drew Bibber, but Max Clare is a guy that I'm eager to see what is coming after what looked like he was going to have a big year last year until the injury.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great pick, because you're just looking for, upper echelon weapons. You're looking for better than average weapons to keep emerging in this offense. And they didn't have enough of them last year. And now it's a thing where if you make every receiver position on this team better, that also sort of enhances your tight end. Your tight end becomes a great source of, check down production. He becomes a great source of, you can run clear outs with the receivers, and it leaves a tight end sometimes completely exposed underneath for completely open underneath. Like there's a lot of things I think you can do with that position. And I am especially interested once we get to see Burhen too. If he's able to get back healthy and back to where he's, a contributing receiver on this team, then the idea of having those two together on the field at once, double tight formations is the reason NFL teams run them a lot. And it's not just about running the ball. It's about just how unpredictable it makes your offense. It doesn't mean you're not still taking your shots downfield. It just changes the personnel that the defense has on the field, and you try to take advantage of that depending on how they adjust or don't. I still have that kind of in the background of like things I'm eager to see about this offense, whether they can get to that point. But I suspect that Burhen being healthy, no offense to the other tight ends, but I think Burhen being healthy probably makes that more possible than any of the other guys. Anybody else you had on the list?
I'm Smart Rigby was one that I had on there. A lot of guys we've seen a lot of, but clearly you want to see out of this first game. If you're a Purdue fan, or if you're Purdue, you don't want to see Purdue go out and win 28-7. This needs to be a 63-0, 56-0. Like, go out, just bury this team in the ground, get a lot of guys on the field, which is the case from 2 years ago, which I thought ended up being a huge benefit to Purdue, because the leading rusher 2 years ago when these two teams played was Devin Maccabee, who was a third or fourth string running back who just in a blowout game was playing in the fourth quarter, and he had a long run and did some good things, and people started to say, hey, like, this is a walk-on running back. We might have something here. And because of injuries, he ends up starting 3 weeks later, and I think it helped. Back to maybe the original point that we started this podcast with, was that he had been in a game environment. He had been able to build some confidence against an inferior opponent And then when he did get his chance, he was ready.
Yeah, and there's guys on this team too, like say Jamal Edrin. I'm more intrigued to see him against Notre Dame than I am against Indiana
Right.
State to some extent. Some of these guys, it'll tell us a lot what they do in a game like this. There's other guys like him, like Will Helt. Like I want to see what those guys do. I've already kind of passed the point where like I believe that they're Big Ten players. It's now I want to see what they do against some of the best teams in the country and what that tells us about what we should expect from Purdue week to week the rest of the season. So that's there are guys that I considered like that, but then when I thought about it, I was like, oh, I don't really. I mean, Jamal Edrin goes for like 130 yards and a touchdown against Indiana State. All right, that sounds like completely plausible. If he does it against Notre Dame, it tells us something completely different about this team. So that's maybe where I was putting guys like that. All right, let's do a prediction. You already, I guess, kind of hinted maybe at where your prediction is going. I'm going to say up front that I believe my prediction is bad, but it's a prediction I made when I was doing my game by game. And I have a guy that I follow for like with his power rankings and his betting stuff, even though I don't bet college football. But that's kind of where I came up with my number based on his stuff. But what is your prediction?
I believe the over-under for those who do bet college football is 49 or 49 and a half, somewhere in that territory. And Purdue's a 32 and a half, 33-point favorite, depending on which which you look at. So
we should say that the line opened around 36 and a half and is down to as low as 32 and a half I've seen. For those of you who bet your beats.
Yeah, I feel like Purdue comes out with something to prove. I really do feel like this is going to be a game that Purdue wins by 42 or 49 points, and where Indiana State struggles to score. And if it does, it's probably an inconsequential touchdown. Either that or it may be like some sort of trick play early. But I think first game you come out, you just try to run your base stuff if you're Purdue. But I think that Purdue's athletes obviously being better than they were a year ago, and this team probably on par, or maybe even talent-wise, a little better than a couple years ago when these two teams played. Purdue's going to impose its will, and it's going to be, I'll say, 49-7.
So I had 38-7, but I think I'm probably wrong. I think I'm probably too low on the Purdue side of that, and I actually may be too high on the Indiana State side of that. It kind of keeps in line with where those metrics I was looking at, but what I think that in this modern era of college football, it's so tough to kind of come up with that sort of prediction week one sometimes if you're not following the team, because you don't really know the impact of some of the transfers. You're not following the day-to-day stuff that's coming out of camp. You don't know about Teron Grant and Shamar Rigby. You just know some numbers on a page. So I think I probably should have gone higher and lower on both. It probably could be, if this game is 42-0, 49-0, something like that, I don't think it would shock me. Now, the one thing I am keeping in mind, though, is we know they're missing some guys already. And that means you're taking everybody from that, a lot of people from that second level and pushing them up. So how quickly does Purdue maybe turn this over to even farther down the depth chart? And does that, start to equate things talent-wise later in this game and it doesn't get as out of hand? I think that's also on the table. But I also think that everything I've seen from Purdue in this camp has only made me more optimistic about how the talent level has gotten better since last year. I don't know how to compare this team to the one that beat Indiana State 56-0 a couple years ago. I don't know how to compare this Indiana State team to that. In the span of Purdue season, obviously neither of those things actually matter very much. But I think the overall theme for Saturday is, does Purdue look like it's in control? I think the score is secondary to that in some ways, because things can go haywire sometimes that affect the score. A punt gets shanked, and instead of pinning somebody, they get the ball at midfield, and they give you the ball back later, but you have to drive farther to get your touchdown. Like those little things can happen sometimes that affect whether a score gets out of hand. But I think it's more about control. Like if my prediction turns out to be right, it's 38-7, but Purdue is up 38-0 going into the fourth quarter. I think they've shown a certain level of control. And I do think that this defense probably has more to prove than this offense. Not that this offense doesn't need to show more explosiveness and more consistency, but it had some built-in excuses last year with the injuries, especially on the offensive line, and not having someone like Jamal Edrin all season. Like this year, they're starting the year healthy on the offensive line for the most part. They've got more talent at receiver. Hudson Card's second year. I feel like this team, especially against the likes of Indiana State, should put up points. Does this defense come out and impose its will and just kind of bury what should be an overmatched opponent?
Yeah, and when you look at Indiana State last year, and again, I'm not super knowledgeable, but I know and what I said earlier is stuff I read this morning, and which wasn't a whole lot, to be honest. I don't know what Indiana State has coming in as far as freshmen or through the transfer portal, things like that. But when you're looking at an FCS team that won one game, that averaged 13 points a game last year, you shouldn't give up any points to that team. If you do, it should be some sort of fluke situation like you kind of referenced. I think it would be a huge deal if Indiana State comes out and gets a shutout just because of what we saw last year with all of the big plays. And in a game like this, sometimes maybe you do try something out of the ordinary, like a receiver throwing a pass or something like that. But I would like to see Indiana State leave this game, I say this as an alum of the university, with 0 points, just for Purdue's sake of going into the bye week with a boatload of confidence, getting guys healthy who aren't playing, who will presumably play against Notre Dame. And then, you have this potentially massively hyped game with a 1-0 team coming off of what would be, in this case, a shutout.
Want to touch real briefly, this is not going to be a huge recruiting weekend for Purdue. The official visit stuff will happen later in the season, and frankly, they'll bring in some bigger recruits for bigger games later this season. But just a couple guys, 3 of the 2025 commits are going to be here. Cam Gorin from Hamilton Southeastern, Sam Stewart, the linebacker who just committed from Homestead, and Landon Brooks, the rush in from Delta. And then just some guys to maybe know about. One thing Purdue I know wants to do is get off to a good start this year because it helps put them in position to either flip guys who are committed elsewhere or start pulling guys back who maybe were leaning somewhere else, because you're proving like, oh, how we said we were going to be better and you can be a part of that. Like, here it is. We're 3-1 going into, week 5 or whatever. So one of those, so a player like that when I hear that is a guy who's going to be here this weekend, Knoxville Catholic cornerback Tyreek King. He's not committed, but Tennessee is in on him, Alabama, A&M, Michigan. Like, he's a top 200 prospect. Getting guys like that is obviously huge for Purdue, and that's the kind of guy that maybe you can make a big impact on, not so much by what you do to Indiana State, but if you, again, emerge early in the season, winning 3 of those first 4. That's why I think that Oregon State-Nebraska corridor there is a big one. Another guy up from Knoxville is a 3-star running back named Jason Thompson. He already has a Purdue offer. Marcelo Vitti is a top 300 4-star safety. A lot of Big Ten teams have offered him: Iowa, Michigan, Penn State, Auburn. He's a guy out of Michigan. Those are like some of the really big ones. Casimir Hicks is a Decatur Central cornerback. So you can tell they're really going like a lot of DB guys that they're going after early in this, as far as the visitors are going to be here for the season opener. He's got a Big Ten offer from Indiana. Cincinnati has offered him. So the Crown Point linebacker Trevor Gibbs has a Big Ten offer from Indiana. Like, there's definitely some guys here who could help Purdue. And this is sort of a muted weekend as far as recruiting, I would say, though. I think you're going to see some bigger things unfold as the season goes on. But
yeah,
go ahead.
Some people might say, why are you, some of these guys you mentioning are top tier recruits, why are you bringing them here for the Indiana State game? But take into account, this isn't the only school they're visiting. I mean, you have to mesh up with their schedules too. And, I assume some of these guys are going to be at 10 different college football venues over the course of a season. So you would like to get them, get in on them early if you can, and then say, hey, we play so-and-so in November, would you like to come back? I know you're open that weekend, type of thing. Hopefully, go ahead.
And you want to be able to focus on the most important guys. You want to spread those guys out too, because if you get too many of them there on the same weekend, I mean, if you have them all there the weekend you beat Oregon, that's going to be great. Not that they probably will have a ton of visitors for a Friday night game, but you know what I'm saying? Like, you want to spread them. Like, I just did this piece on Dylan Thieneman a few weeks ago when I was talking to people, his family and his coaches. You know, one of the things they mentioned was when he was getting recruited, and he didn't get as recruited out of high school as he thought he should have, and as it looks like he should have. But one thing that would happen was, like, yeah, you'd go on visits to schools and you'd get there and you'd get kind of a cold shoulder. And that was a message to him, you know, that this school, even though they're willing to recruit me and bring me up, they're not really showing me the same love that I see them showing other players. So you also want to keep that in mind, that you're putting yourself in position to, and you sometimes, again, sometimes it is wholly dependent on their schedule. Like, they're saying, yes, I agree, I will come up for that game. I am committed elsewhere other weekends, but I'll come up to your game. But then also, you've got 3 commits on campus this weekend too, guys who can mingle with those guys and, answer questions that they have and try to influence them to join the recruiting class. So there's a lot of nuance to the recruiting thing. A lot of things aren't as cut and dry as we sometimes make them out to be. And I think the visit procedure is one of those things. Speaking of recruiting, we want to talk about big recruiting news for basketball. Luke Ertel out of Mount Vernon committed earlier this week, 6'2", left-handed point guard, had really elevated, had a football injury, a former football player, had a football injury that had impacted his high school career. But once he got healthy, put together a really impressive summer. And Purdue is obviously one of the people that was most impressed by him. And he becomes the first commit for 2026, correct?
Yeah. And, if you're Purdue or a Purdue fan, you're looking, obviously always looking in the current, because the team has the potential to do something pretty special here, and clearly is coming off of its best season, ever, if not since 1969. But you're thinking, like, what happens when Braden Smith is gone? Well, this kid is, I'm not going to say he's Braden Smith, who's obviously talk about under-recruited guys out of Westfield. Maybe it's just something in the Westfield water, like we, let those guys go to Purdue and then have great careers. But beyond what he is, you want a floor general. I think Braden Smith is a true point guard that maybe Purdue had been missing for a while. You had, the Jaden Ivies and Carson Edwards and Nojel Easterns and guys like that. Braden Smith is a true point guard, grew up a point guard, has a point guard mentality. And I think just from the stuff I've watched on YouTube and recruiting profiles and so forth, Ertel appears to be very much the same mold, and other than being left-handed, does a lot of the same things, attacks the basket and gets rebounds. Something Braden Smith was great at last year was, Painter said, we would rather have Braden Smith go grab the rebound and start the break than having somebody grab the rebound, then have to go find out where Braden is, get him the ball, and then we can start setting up our offense. You shave off some time and get ahead of the defense a little bit if you have a point guard who can rebound. And it looks like Luke Ertel very much is a willing guy to go in there and grab the ball out of the air and just take off the other direction. So I really like that about him. Looks like he can shoot. I know that on highlight films, you're not going to put yourself missing jump shots, but looks like he has a pretty smooth jump, is able to create. And most importantly, I throw stars out the window when we're talking about Purdue basketball, because Matt Painter is going to recruit guys who fit Purdue and has done a very good job of finding those guys. And I think that's probably the biggest thing about this, is it seems like kind of a fit for Purdue.
Yeah, I definitely look at stars differently in basketball than I do in football. And I think it's fair to then even further curve it when you're talking about the way Matt Painter recruits, because his recruiting method has obviously proven to be a good way to go about it. And in Purdue's point guard history, it seems like it has been tough for them to always find the right mix that they're looking for there. I can remember when I was covering that program, kind of early when I was covering that program, it seemed like they got in this cycle of where you're taking kind of undersized scoring guards and turning them into point guards. There was varying levels of success with that. You sometimes would get guys who were true point guards, but maybe weren't as how do I want to say it? Like, maybe weren't as team inclined as other guys were, and that affected like how effective you are as a point guard. They took guys who were tremendous defensive players but had offensive liabilities. Like, they've been trying to find that right mix of things, and as you wrote about last year, Braden Smith has really filled a lot of that deficit, and and really kind of lock down what it means to be a Purdue point guard. And I wonder if that gives them a prototype now that they try to follow more in the future. But anytime you lock down like guys in state who are advanced players and who you think fit in your mold, like I feel like in recent Purdue history, I think there's a good pattern of success of those guys paying off. So that is a commitment that came in early this week for basketball. We're going to keep obviously monitoring recruiting on both of those sports. I was told, the way I understand it, I mean, I'm just kind of getting back into it as far as the dynamics of the program. But for 2025, there was originally going to be a focus just on a front court player, maybe like a four or a big wing sort of thing. And when the NCAA expanded the rosters, that opened Purdue up to then also maybe go after a guard in 2025. So that class is still waiting on its first commitment, but I think the dynamic has changed there a little bit. And they were out in front of that. Matt Painter serves on national committees that I think he's keyed in on when those changes are coming, and they were able to maybe get out a little bit ahead of that ruling coming and alter the strategy as it had been going up to that point.
Yeah, and then the one thing with Purdue, and Matt Painter has not been shy about this. He doesn't care much for the transfer portal. He will add a Lance Jones or there's some guy that just we have a need and this is a system situation. But he said it's probably get to that combined state, but I will recruit at a high school, develop them, have them for 3 or 4 years, and go about this that way. So he's nowadays, because I don't follow every program in the country, but I think less and less you're seeing high school coaches, college coaches at high school games, or AAU, or it's like you're quick to dismiss a guy and just go after somebody in the transfer portal, especially now that you have this collective and you can basically ask them what dollar figure they're looking for. Painter watches, I get a guy who doesn't care about the money. As the Kenan Kitchen situation showed, I don't care about what your needs are. It's how do you fit into this team and the culture, and if it's like you're not good, then we'll go get somebody else.
Yeah, they've obviously used the portal in a very supplementary kind of way, and I do sometimes wonder though, like, okay, that's all well and good, but when a 5-star caliber player who started his career elsewhere says, I want to come to Purdue and I don't really care that much about the money, then it's probably not as much a complimentary player that they end up with. I think someday we're probably going to see someday where a important person, a major impact player transfers to Purdue, not just a role player. And we'll see if it was, but I don't think it'll happen if it means getting involved in an arms race. So it's going to have to be like every other recruitment is, I think, with this program. The circumstances are going to really have to fit the philosophies that have been laid down here for decades. Anything else you want to throw out before we sign off before this season opener?
I think next week being a bye week, we'll have a chance to kind of probably get into more basketball talk, and then obviously we'll have some things to talk about from the opening game. So I think that's kind of a good week to catch up on some of the topics that for time consumption we probably don't need to get into right now. So we can probably cut it off there and just next week pick up some unique topics that typically we wouldn't talk about after the first game of a football season.
We should briefly mention, come to IndyStar.com, come to JCOnline.com all week, morning of the game. Follow us on Twitter. I'm at NW Baird. You are at Samuel T. King. We'll just have content all weekend long around this season opening game. I'm working on a feature on Kydron Jenkins. I don't know if it'll be out before the game. It might be out early next week. Also been working on one about Joey Tanona, who's going to be, has returned to football and just happens to be playing his old team, Notre Dame, here in a short amount of time. So I'll have those. Anything you're working on that fans should be looking for?
Yeah, and I will tell people to go to IndyStar.com, JCOnline.com, wherever you get your content from. Your Dylan Thieneman story was the one where you talked about his brothers about watching his debut last year in a sports bar in a random Colorado town.
Not random. It's Dillon, Colorado, the town
Right.
that he was named for.
It was a great piece and kind of gives some people some perspective on why he's the way he is. You had a lot of really good sources in there who could talk about his, life and career, all growing up. That, a lot of things, even somebody who covered him for a whole season last year, I didn't know a lot of that stuff. So very good piece, worth reading. I just this morning posted a story about Mo Omanade, who's 6 foot and plays defensive tackle for a Big Ten team, which is very, unique because, when he's being recruited, a lot of coaches would just ignore the fact that he could do everything you wanted him to do on a football field because he was 6 feet tall and at the time 250 pounds. And now he's possibly going to be starting in the season opener as a West Lafayette high school graduate, wrestled for a couple of years, was in the state championship match at heavyweight after wrestling basically like 35 career matches or something like that. So just a freak athlete. And I think that's kind of a great story about Mark Hagan, the old co-defensive coordinator, giving a guy a chance based on his film and then him kind of proving everybody right by taking a chance on him. I will have kind of a little scouting report on Indiana State today. It's not a lot because, quite frankly, there's not a lot to detail there. And then the shoe thing I mentioned, once we get to the game Saturday, which will be a couple hours before, and I see the players out on the field and we can get some photos of what they're wearing and things like that. Again, I'm not a huge shoe guy. I've started to delve into it a little bit, but it seems like a very expensive hobby. But I'll detail kind of, some of the marquee players, what they're wearing, and the story behind the designs that they're wearing. So look forward to that in the game. It's probably a little kind of trendy piece once you start seeing the start of the game on TV and see what some of these players are wearing.
Here's how not a shoe guy I am. At this stage of my life, my feet hurt. I'm an old man now, and an old man of 46, and my feet hurt. So now I'm in the process of getting new shoes, and all I care about is how comfortable they are. Like I might just be going to like full on orthopedic shoe boxes, whatever those things are that you wear on your feet, like just pillows. I might just come with pillows tied to my feet on Saturday morning.
Well, just head over to Costco and spend $20 or something and get the most comfortable pair that they have on the shelf.
Yep, that may be where I'm quickly headed in my so-called life. But thanks to everyone for joining us here on Boilers Extra. Wherever you find us, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes. I know you hear this from every podcast you listen to. Like and subscribe. Those things are important to us. It helps other people find the podcast. So even if you listen to this and you're like, hey, that was pretty good, go ahead and give us like a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify or whatever. And we're not saying that you have to tell us that we're perfect. That's not necessarily what that means, but it just helps recommend it to other people out there. And we're excited to be doing this. We're going to keep doing this every week. Come back Saturday after the game. We will have post-game pods every Saturday after the game. That might be a little bit off kilter for some of the road games later on this season, but we're going to be doing something after games, some kind of a reaction quickly after games. So come back to Boilers Extra wherever you find it for that. For Sam King, I'm Nathan Baird. Thanks for joining.